I'm Natalie Wood with the National Conference of State Legislatures, or NCSL. NCSL serves and represents all 7,383 state legislators and those in the territories in the United States, and the over 25,000 legislative staff that work within our state capitals. We are bipartisan in our composition and nonpartisan in the work that we do. NCSL has a multi-pronged mission: to be a convener and forum for policy ideas, to provide nonpartisan research and analysis to our members, to serve as the voice of state legislators on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. before our federal government, and to strengthen the effectiveness and independence and integrity of the legislative branch of government. I have the pleasure of leading NCSL's Center for Legislative Strengthening, which provides analysis, consultation, and research for our members on legislative operations and the legislative institution. This includes everything from legislative processes, legislative human resources, and legislative information technology, all of which have been affected by the pandemic. But we'll talk more about that in just a moment. First, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Pam Greenberg.
My role at NCSL includes researching how legislatures in the US use technology to support and enhance the legislative process and to promote citizen engagement. I also work with NCSL's National Association of Legislative Information Technology, called NAIL IT, which is a network of information technology professionals who work in all 50 US state legislatures. The leadership of NAIL IT is made up of a 10-member executive committee that guides the program and activities of the association. Legislative IT staff from different states make up the executive committee. And NAIL IT's mission is first to promote the exchange of ideas and information on all aspects of information systems, including management and technical development. Second, to provide a network of information exchange for its members. And then last but not least, to foster better relations between legislative IT staff and the legislators and legislative staff that they serve. NAIL IT has a website and an online newsletter. They host a listserv for members to pose questions and receive answers about IT issues they're facing. NAIL IT also holds occasional webinars or video conferencing meetings. And in normal pre-pandemic times, they meet twice a year in person for in-depth training and networking events. Now I'll turn it back to Natalie.
I'm going to provide an overview of US state legislative operations in quote unquote normal times. I'll give you themes with respect to the transitions and strategies they adopted in light of COVID-19 and give you some state examples. Pam is going to delve more into the specifics and nuance about technological adaptations that were made. Those who work in state legislatures learn to expect the unexpected. Dramatic floor votes, impassioned speeches, citizen protests, and even HVAC and plumbing issues can arise on any given day, sometimes in the same day, probably not dissimilar from any of the parliaments or governmental institutions in which you work. And they've prepared and dealt with many different challenges like earthquakes, fires, wars, Y2K, and even H1N1. However, nothing before quite prepared them for how to function through a global pandemic. Over the past year, state legislatures, like all public institutions, have focused on their continuity of government. This involves executing plans to allow legislatures to convene, communicate, and decision-make in an emergency. How to keep members, staff, and visitors safe. Which legislation was critical to tackle and what could wait? Should the Capitol stay open to the public? What did Constitution and state law require? And what IT options were available and what would work best? It's important to understand that in quote unquote normal times, legislatures and legislative chambers in the US operate in unique ways. In fact, we often say at NCSL that there are at least 99 approaches to running a state legislative institution because there are 99 state legislative chambers, and then there are the territories as well. These differences, be it with respect to the time in which they have to meet, the number of elected officials in each chamber, or the physical space that the legislature occupies, all played into their continuity plan. In 2020, nearly all state and territorial legislatures met. 3 did not, as actually 4 in total meet every other year in the US, but one of those had a special session. So 3 did not meet last year, but the rest did. In addition, 39 legislatures have some sort of limit on the days in which they can meet in session. So those are all factors that legislatures needed to take into account as they decided how to move forward. Some paused their sessions so they could assess the best approach moving forward, and others continue to meet without skipping a beat. However, each legislative chamber had to create contingencies and plans for meeting during the pandemic. Common themes to continuity planning were enhanced health and safety protocols for physical work in state capitals, moving some staff to remote work arrangements, and tapping into new technology tools. And legislatures adjusted and in some cases completely revolutionized their approaches to meeting. They met in sports arenas and in concert venues. They met outside in reception tents and in fields. They met in museums. They met in the Capitol, but spread out in the chamber, the gallery, or their offices during session or committee hearings. They met using virtual tools like Zoom, or they used a combination of these approaches. And I could talk about all their different strategies all day, but you want to know about digital readiness. I'll next highlight the different ways legislatures incorporated remote participation into their floor operations and their processes and committees. During both the 2020 and 2021 legislative sessions, many US legislative chambers amended their rules or adopted new rules or implemented policies to allow for remote participation, quote unquote, on the floor or in formal session and in committee proceedings. In 2021, in at least 26 states, one chamber or both thus far has adopted rules or procedures for remote participation on the floor. In at least 34 states, one chamber or both has adopted rules or procedures for members to participate remotely in committee. One chamber or both has adopted rules that permit members to vote in areas other than the chamber floor, but they're still within the Capitol or on the Capitol grounds. A legislative chamber's ability to integrate remote participation obviously hinges on logistical considerations like technology, and Pam is going to talk more about that in just a moment. But they also hinge on legal considerations. And legislatures had to contemplate what their constitutions, case law, statutes, existing rules, all of that, all of those legal issues, what they said with respect to facets of the process, such as obtaining a quorum or the minimum amount of members needed to conduct business, or defining present to vote. What did present mean? Did it mean physically present or could it mean something else? And lastly, but not an exhaustive list, where the seat of government is located. As a result, some US legislatures decided that remote participation was not an option for them. Another thing to know is that in most cases, these rule changes are designed to be temporary at this point. They may end by a certain date and they are tied to emergency orders. Whether or not these practices will continue post-pandemic remains to be seen. And it's also not to say that legislatures didn't have ability to participate remotely in the past. Some in fact did with respect to committee proceedings, and others in limited ways did allow remote participation on the floor per rules, though it definitely was not a constant thing that happened. Remote participation for legislators has been one of a few tools that allow legislative bodies to be flexible in response to the challenges of meeting during a pandemic. In practice, plugging into the process virtually varies considerably across the US. And take these examples, for instance. Some chambers, like the Vermont House and Senate, the Virginia House of Representatives, and the Washington House of Representatives, have been totally or almost totally virtual. Others are using it as an option. The presiding officer or committee chair must authorize a fellow legislator to participate virtually. And examples of this include Colorado, Nevada, and South Dakota. Virtual participation doesn't just mean video, doesn't just mean Zoom or Teams or some other platform. It can mean conference calls, which is the case in New Jersey. Both the Assembly and Senate are allowing conference call capability for their remote proceedings, but they're also interplaying that with Zoom for committee hearings and in-person meetings as well. Another point to know is that some rules only specify, as I mentioned before, that members may participate in another location within the chamber, the Capitol, or Capitol grounds. Alabama House, the Arkansas House, the Texas House, and both chambers in Connecticut and Kentucky have rule language with these types of provisions. And a final, last big operational change. Like many of us, legislative staff worked remotely over the course of the past year. I'm going to turn it back over to Pam so she can talk about how these adjustments affected the trajectory of information technology services within legislatures.
The COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact, as Natalie said, on US state legislative information technology offices. IT offices acted swiftly in 2020 to ensure continuity of the legislature, changing priorities, and building new applications and systems in record time. Prior to the pandemic, legislative IT CIOs and directors identified the following as their top 5 priority issues in a survey that we conducted. First priority, combating security threats and taking increased security measures. Second, developing or enhancing legislative applications, such as bill drafting or bill status, committee systems, and so forth. Third, developing or supporting tools for online and citizen engagement. Fourth, developing or supporting collaboration tools. And then number 5, developing or refining systems to enable a paperless environment. Last August, in the midst of the pandemic, we surveyed again these legislative CIOs and found that they had shifted priorities and provided new services to meet the demands of a remote workforce and to support virtual legislative sessions and hearings. Despite the new priorities, one issue remained at the top: security. And that's not surprising, since the shift to more remote work also heightened security threats. So the top priorities identified included, first, as I mentioned, again, combating security threats. And second, developing new applications to support remote sessions, hearings, or voting, instead of those more traditional applications that I mentioned earlier. And third, enabling a paperless environment. That moved up to the number 3 position in this survey. Again, not surprising given the more remote work environment and the need for ways to transfer and work on documents electronically. Fourth, evaluating utilizing more cloud-based services for email, documents, and collaboration sites. And fifth, obtaining funding necessary for many of these new IT projects. So always a challenge, but particularly so when you need to purchase new equipment and so forth. As I mentioned, legislative IT staff worked quickly in 2020 to provide equipment, to ensure network security, and provide training and support for legislative staff and legislators who began working from home, some for the first time. Programmers worked to develop or implement new voting applications, such as remote voting tools, but also within a very short time frame. IT staff in many legislatures also set up and secured video conferencing software so that legislative proceedings could be conducted remotely. They created ways to prevent intrusions to the Zoom calls and looked at multi-factor authentication for legislators participating and voting in the calls. Importantly, IT staff allowed time for testing, training, and practice to make sure the legislative process translated to a virtual one, and that legislators and staff could understand, be comfortable with, and still comply with legislative rules and procedures. While all 50 state legislatures had already provided live streaming of floor sessions for many years, IT professionals worked in 2020 to provide more coverage of committees and public hearings, and to make recordings available online for on-demand viewing by the public. In committee rooms, in state capitals, IT staff had to set up screens, equipment, cameras, so that the meetings could be live streamed. And many also added closed captioning to live streams and recordings for this past year for the first time, although some had previously done so. And this year, as legislative sessions began, we saw a huge uptick in the number of legislatures providing online opportunities for public participation. Many legislatures added online forms so the public could submit electronic comments and opinions about bills or upload written testimony. And many also created online forms for citizens to request to testify before a committee without having to visit the state capitol. So Natalie's going to talk now a little bit more about public outreach.
Some legislatures have actually publicly stated that these technological changes Pam mentioned are in fact dramatically increasing public participation in the process and in their tracking. North Dakota, for example, recently noted that as of last month, live streams had drawn more than 234,000 live and on-demand views, and that remote testimony drew just over 1,500 registrants. The theme of increased public access as a result of these modifications has been echoed in other legislatures as well. But on the flip side, some have argued that closed state houses coupled with remote participation can be problematic, citing concerns about citizens who lack technology or access to broadband. Still others have said that a Zoom room simply cannot replicate the important, impromptu, interpersonal interactions that normally occur in person under Capitol domes. We at NCSL will continue to serve as a resource and connection point for our legislatures and our members as they learn from each other over the course of the pandemic. We thank Bússola Tech for the opportunity to participate in this conference, and we wish you the best for the rest of your conference experience.